You're listening to the Career Bootcamp, your supply chain career accelerated, a 5-podcast series sponsored by IBM and powered by Procurious. Hello, I'm Helen McKenzie, Principal Advisor at Procurious, and I'm your host for this series that's designed to get your wheels moving forward towards the supply chain role of your dreams. Our podcast features coaches from supply chain, academia, and the world of cycling. They'll be sharing their top career tips and how you can learn from their experience to get ahead. Today's coach is Steve Day. Steve has been a supply chain executive for many years, most recently the Senior Vice President, Supply Chain and Global Operations at Pearson. He's currently working with an S&P 500 company, helping the leadership team redesign their product and business models to respond to the digital transformation that's underway in the content industry. Steve's led several operational transformations. He's also developed new business models to support enterprise-wide evolution from products to services and software revenue models, and these have often been innovative new approaches. Steve has significant experience of delivering new growth opportunities and improvements through the power of the supply chain. Welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Thank you, Helen.
You've had a pretty wide-ranging and global career. It'd be great if you could describe to our listeners how you got to where you are now.
Started my career in engineering, believe it or not, and I worked for a number of very famous English companies that sadly are no longer with us, such as Rover and Massey Ferguson. But in truth, I always had a bit of an interest in telecoms, so I was very fortunate in the 1990s to join Nortel Networks, and thereafter spent almost 20 years in telecom, going straight to T-Mobile and Deutsche Telekom, a short interlude at a company called Cable and Wireless, and thereafter almost 10 years with Vodafone, which was a fabulous opportunity because not only was it at a time when the business was growing enormously, but it was also an opportunity to travel quite extensively and live abroad. So my journey with Vodafone was first to spend 3 years in Romania with my family. We had a wonderful time there, returning to the UK for 3 years and then spending 3 years in Luxembourg, which is where Vodafone's global sourcing centre is. And thereafter, I left Vodafone, spent a year with a private equity company in Munich in Germany, and then returned to the UK in 2016 and joined Pearson, which is a company that has a very rich heritage, used to own brands such as The Economist, the Financial Times, and Penguin. But in its recent formation, decided to focus on educational publishing. And with my kind of very diverse procurement and supply chain experience in telecoms, they wanted some help transforming the way they thought about running their publishing supply chain, which is what I completed in April of this year.
Well, what a diverse career you've had there, for going all the way from engineering through to educational publishing. Okay, so let's have a look at the theme of our podcast for this week, which is cycling. And we've been asking our bootcamp coaches about that. And I understand, Steve, it's not really your type of exercise. So what do you do to keep in shape?
Yeah, well, cycling has never really been my cup of tea, but in recent times, got myself into the gym and have been doing that very intensely. But it also coincides with the family deciding to get a dog of all things. And for anybody that is wondering how they can get some exercise into their busy schedules, I suggest they get a dog, because it's a great reason to get out and spend an hour or so stretching the legs. So that's really my exercise regime.
Okay, what habits and practices have you used to differentiate yourself and move your career forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because when you take a sabbatical, as I have done, it's a good opportunity to kind of reflect through your journey in your career and kind of what's worked well and the areas that you need to think about in the future. As I think about the things that I've always had a habit of doing and therefore I would think have helped contribute to my success, I think learning and looking to identify new ideas or new sources of innovation or new ways about thinking about doing the role is very, very important. And as I think through the journey of my career, I started in the workplace in the 90s. We didn't have the abundance of social media that's available to us today. So that was a lot harder than it is today, for sure. Of course, today you just have so much out there that you have to use your antenna a little bit to screen out what's the interesting stuff versus the stuff that is not really worth investing in. But to anybody out there, what I would say is that keeping current and keeping familiar with where some of the thought leaders are is really, really important, and allying yourself to their podcasts, some of the materials they publish in print, and using your network are really, really important ingredients in terms of keeping yourself relevant and being able to have conversations through industry about different topics. So I think that's a really, really important thing. The second thing I think that does is it gives you a currency to talk to stakeholders throughout your business about topics that are different necessarily than procurement and supply chain. And leaders like that, if you're in a corridor and you get the opportunity to bump into the CEO, talking to them more broadly about some of the themes that are going on in the business gives them a sense about your character and how you are more aware about some of the broader issues going on in the organisation. And I've found that often gives me the license to then go and approach them about other ideas that I might have or thoughts that I might have about things that we can change that might not necessarily originate from the procurement or the supply chain function. The final thing I would definitely ascribe to a habit that I've had for a long time is reading. Someone has told me there's a phrase going around, leaders are readers. I think reading is such an important habit that you have to get into. And I would even be as provocative as to say it doesn't really matter what you read. I just think the opportunity to have a half an hour a day and just read something, absorb it and think about it is a really, really important skill. And you're reading something that may be work related, so it gives you, as I said, some extra currency to talk about in the workplace, or it may be just a habit of relaxation. So, reading I think is really, really important.
Some great habits there for our listeners to think about incorporating into their lives and their work routines. Thanks for that. Okay, what's the one mistake you see people making in their careers?
I see people get into a couple of bad habits that I think sometimes are not healthy for them. And one of them is people get fatigued with the organisation, or they disagree with its course of action, but they still hold on. And I've often wondered to myself whether it would be better for them to be brave enough to move on and explore new opportunities and see where their career goes. I just think, people get so wedded to the need to cover their pensions or their salary, they end up really miserable and not really enjoying the work that they're doing. And if you think about it, our work career is relatively short, so you want to be doing the most interesting work that you really think you can engage with, you feel energized about, and you feel you can make a difference. So for those of you that are frustrated, you don't agree with the strategy, then I really encourage you to kind of think about moving on. And that's a lot easier these days than it's ever been. In terms of industry needs great procurement and supply chain people. There's no doubt about that. And the good news is there is a shortage of good people around. If you don't have those skills and you don't have those capabilities, then for goodness sake, invest in yourself and invest in yourself quickly. The other thing I find is that kind of people knock at your door and say, where's my development plan? Where's my training? And I think, honestly, you've got to own that. And then the final thing I'd say is kind of be brave. I really enjoy working with people that challenge and question. Now, of course, there's a way to do that. You have to do it respectfully, of course, and you have to do it with a tone that is positive and constructive. But never be afraid to challenge or ask the difficult questions if you feel that something has been missed out in the approach in a corporation, or you think they're missing out on an opportunity. And if I think going back to my career when I started, the idea that you could ask the CEO out and out a difficult question would have been unheard of. You would have had to have gone through several levels of managerial approval before you could even get to meet the CEO, let alone ask a question. So we live in different times, and I think everybody should just take advantage of that, ask the difficult questions and frame the conversation. And as I've said, to my experience and some of the success I've had, I think you get a lot of respect from the organisation, the leaders within it, if you're thinking much more broadly about where the business is going and how your function can contribute to some of those challenges.
Thanks very much. There's some good tips there for people to take on board. Over your career, I'm sure you've had a lot of different teams that you've led. Why is it important to put effort into your team rather than just your own personal development?
It's a really interesting question, this one, and I think it's very much been linked to my career growth. And I think it's rare in businesses that success is attributable to one person. I mean, let's be honest, although Apple has been phenomenally successful, Steve Jobs was very, very clever at building a talent pool of people within that business that could lead on a number of multiple fronts. And similarly for Jeff Bezos' business, Amazon, it started off as a very narrow focused online bookstore and has become this enormous business. All of that success has come about from the capability of people and their teams. It hasn't necessarily come about from the capability of one particular individual. So, look, there's lots of research and lots of evidence out there that says high performing teams are really the thing that makes success. So, I come from it from the perspective of that. And therefore, I think as a leader, you have an absolute obligation to make sure that the team that you're setting up has the ability to be successful. And as you think about formulating your team these days, there's a number of things that you need to consider. Diversity is a much broader concept now than it's ever been before. It was a very narrow agenda-based topic. Now it's sexual diversity, cultural diversity, and now I think increasingly it's also about intellectual diversity as well. Think about teams that all have the same approach and the same way of thinking about things. Sometimes doesn't lead to necessarily the best type of outcomes. So I think you've got to think about that. I think you've got to think about how having that development capability conversations with the teams and making sure that you are giving them access to the resources they need to develop their skills so that they can be relevant to the corporation going forward. And then finally, in the moment feedback. So again, lots of us will be familiar with the annual appraisal reviews. I think there's a lot of research out there that's shown that has increasingly become quite ineffective, and actually good feedback is about in the moment feedback. So if someone does something wrong, you talk about how that could have improved and how they can avoid it in the future. If they've done something well, you celebrate it in the moment and give positive feedback. And I think that's all part of creating the right culture and developing the team so that you can be successful.
Okay, we're getting towards the end of the podcast now, and some more advice from you to conclude. So if you were giving advice to yourself at an earlier stage of your career, what would you say is the most important factor that can contribute to success?
There's a couple of things, and as I kind of thought about this question ahead of today's podcast, one of the things that occurred to me was that get the opportunity to work with good leaders. I mean, I've worked with some really good people that had the faith in me in my career. I can tell you that each and every one of them had the faith in me to take on the challenges that they presented with me. And I also learned a hell of a lot from them in terms of how they approached stakeholder management, how they approach negotiations and things like that. So I think I've been fortunate because I've worked with people that really inspired me, and I think that's something that you need to ask yourself sometimes, is that the people that you're surrounded about, are they inspiring you, and are they learning the skills that are going to help you develop going forward? So that's one point. As I've said through this podcast, I've taken a bit of a sabbatical for the past 6 months, and one of the things that is good for the soul is just kind of reflecting on the journey. And I think to all of you that are, starting your careers now, growing your career, enjoy what you do. To my point that I'll come to in a minute, enjoy the work, enjoy the people that you're working with, enjoy your achievements. And whilst it's tempting to think about what's next, sometimes it's also good just to pause on how well you've done so far. So that's one thing I definitely encourage people to do. The thing that I often think about when someone said to me, how have you managed your career? I said to them, well, I think I've been very lucky. And they turned around to me and said, well, luck is when preparation and opportunity come together. So I think prepare like hell. And if you think about what that looks like in terms of your daily career, it means putting in the shift to do a good job. It means learning, reading, constantly developing. And as I said, I think that onus is on you. It's not necessarily on the corporation you're working for. And thirdly, when there are interesting projects or difficult things to tackle, put your hand up and give it a go, because companies like people that are prepared to take on challenges, are prepared to do the difficult work rather than necessarily the easy stuff. So that's the thing on preparation. In terms of opportunity, I just think work hard to put yourself into a position where opportunities can become available. For those of you that are starting out in your career, your network is really, really important. Someone once told me that many, many years ago, and I didn't really understand what they meant. Certainly in the past couple of years, I've begun to appreciate how important it is to stay connected to people that you've worked with, or reach out to people that you've not really had a relationship with before, but you might necessarily want to exchange points of view or have a conversation with them. And I have to tell you, in my experience, most people are only too willing to have that conversation with you or share some points of your insights. So develop that network, and as I said, prepare hard, and everything else will take care of itself.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Steve. And out of all of those nuggets of wisdom that you've just shared with us, what's the one action that our listeners could take today to start to achieve that?
Well, if you're listening to this podcast and any of it has resonated with you, then I think in truth you've already started, because what you're doing is you're building a network. The fact that Helen Procurious has asked me to say a few words today, and that we'll share this on LinkedIn, is again, an example of how that network works and operates. So, I would encourage you to start thinking about your network now. Look at what information is out there and begin to start using it to create and build a deep, meaningful set of people that you can reach out into the future.
Okay, thank you very much to Steve Day for being our Career Bootcamp coach on this episode. You've been listening to the Career Bootcamp podcast series, your supply chain career accelerated, sponsored by IBM and powered by Procurious. Why not head on over to the Supply Chain Pros group on Procurious, where you'll find lots more related content. If you have a question about the series or for our guests, please use the discussion board on Procurious or the hashtag Career Bootcamp on Twitter. Thank you for listening.